Hi, we are joined today by Katherine Eban, the author of a sensational book that released in 2019. It's called The Bottle of Lies, Ranbaxy and the Dark Side of the Indian Pharma. It has generated a lot of heated debate with accusations of perhaps not being too fair towards the Indian pharma industry. But the more disturbing element of the book is how it exposes what little regard these drug companies have for the people they're making the drugs for. And for those of us living in India and other developing countries, how far down the rung we come when it comes to their priorities. Thank you, Katherine, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start, I just want you to explain to our viewers here what generic drugs mean. They're different from brand name drugs, and what is that difference?
So generic drugs are not supposed to be very different. They're supposed to be bioequivalent, which means that they will work the same way in the body as the brand name drug. So typically, a brand name drug has been innovated or created by a brand name company, and then it's protected by a patent. And after a certain amount of time, that patent lapses, and then a generic company will come in and reverse engineer the brand drug, which means figure out how to make it in a laboratory. But it's the same molecule, and it is supposed to work similarly in the body. It began in 2008. I got a phone call from a man in the US who has a radio show about pharmaceuticals. American patients were calling him and complaining about side effects from their generic drugs, that they were having relapses when they were switched from brand to generic. He thought that there was a serious problem. He brought those complaints to our FDA, and they said, well, it's probably psychosomatic. You know, patients have a negative response if their medication looks different. So I began with what was more like reporting a consumer health story. But as I learned more, I shifted my attention to the markets where the majority of our generic drugs are made, which is India and China. 40% of our supply of generics is coming from India. So the US is really very dependent on India and China to supply both active ingredient and finished doses. For a long time, I hadn't met him, but I knew about Ranbaxy. I knew that there was a whistleblower investigation. He was tasked by his boss with trying to figure out, is the data in Ranbaxy's regulatory filings globally real or fake? And when he finally put together all of this data, he uncovered the fact that more than 200 drug products in more than 40 countries were filed by Ranbaxy with fake data. I mean, this was literally a system of fraud that was institutionalized throughout the company, to the extent that you had senior executives who were being asked to smuggle in samples of drugs in suitcases, and then they would use those samples to test and create data that made it look like their own.
But before this, your book actually begins on a very positive note. It talks about Gandhi, and it talks about Yusuf Hamid from Cipla, and how he actually transformed how HIV drugs were distributed and reaching the people who needed them the most. So there was a very positive side to generic drugs.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really a heroic chapter, I think, in Indian history, in the history of public health. The idea that you could take US taxpayer dollars, that India could make affordable medicines and break through this obstacle course of patents, and as part of a global collaboration, that we could get life-saving drugs to Africa is wonderful. I mean, that is all good. The problem is what happened after that.
There was a bit of there was problem also earlier because the US FDA rules sort of lend themselves to corruption. There's that chapter where you describe pharmaceutical executives lining up outside FDA just wanting to be the first to get inside the door. And it's incredible how patents and licenses were being issued in this manner.
It's extraordinary. The incentive was called first to file. Basically what that legislation said was the first company, the very first one, to put down an application for a drug in the US with the FDA, if they were approved, they would have 6 months of exclusivity on the market, which is essentially the difference between making a living and making a fortune. That was so lucrative, that first to file, that when Ranbaxy got it for generic Lipitor, which is the largest generic launch in the US, they made $600 million in 6 months. So this is big money.
And eventually they had to withdraw the drug from the market because...
They did. I mean, it turned out that it was suffused with glass particles due to a massive manufacturing failure, and it was recalled. First of all, they reviewed data from companies, right? And they don't test the drugs. And as the head of the FDA's generic drug office said to me, our application system relies on the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down. Then, when they inspect overseas plants, they give the plants months of advance notice that they're coming. And that gives the plants time to create a facade of compliance.
The reaction that's coming to your book, that's coming from a lot of Indian pharma companies, is that, not everyone's bad, and the book focuses so much on the bad and it's not focusing on the good, that it's painting a very negative image of the Indian pharma industry. What's your reaction to that?
I guess I have a few different reactions. First of all, the book absolutely showcases the very positive history here and the contributions of Indian pharma. The heroes of the book are Indian. The people who blew the whistle on this conduct are Indian, concerned about the health of patients worldwide, concerned about the health of Indians, heroically blowing the whistle at risk to themselves. I did what journalists must, right, which is simply to follow the facts where they led.
One of the things that, again, one of the facts that the story led to was something that us Indians and other people in developing countries should be extremely concerned about. The book talks about a grading system where companies are making certain level of drugs to suit the most stringent regulators in the US and Europe, and making another level of drugs for developing countries who have slightly lax regulation.
So what you're describing actually has a name inside of the industry. It's called dual track production. To me, essentially that amounts to a manufacturing standard of whatever you can get away with. We'll make our best drugs for the more regulated markets, and we'll send our worst drugs that won't pass in any other market to Africa and even to India. I think that is really tragic. When I started reporting this project, I just assumed a pill is a pill. If you buy it in Mumbai or you buy it in Memphis, there should be no difference whatsoever. But in fact, the drugs are different in different markets.
So there is this conundrum where we can't afford brand name drugs. What is the solution?
Good regulation is essential, but I think another part of this is patient vigilance. So if patients take a drug, they should see who the manufacturer is. They should know, and they should think about how they feel. Are they suffering side effects? And do their symptoms or side effects seem to change between prescription changes, right? I mean, those are all clues that they may be suffering from a substandard generic. So they need to pay attention to that.
So to empower yourself, to be aware of the kind of drugs that you're taking, the kind of treatment that's being offered, ask questions. And it was a pleasure talking to you, Katherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so nice to talk to you.